Very welcome, Ruth Schneier.
Good morning. So I want to talk about cyber attacks and cyber threats and cyber conflict here in the early 21st century. And I want to start by talking about Sony. I think the Sony case is a really good example that encapsulates a lot of the issues of cyber conflict. And it's worth going through the story in detail, and then I want to talk about some general things about it. So I think we all know basically the Sony story. I'm going to start from the way beginning. A couple of things relevant before the actual attack. Now, the first one is in 2010, and we know this from the Snowden documents, that there were two code-named NSA operations to penetrate the North Korean military and government networks. There was one that it was known in the documents as a fourth-party attack, and I think it's kind of cool. This is the NSA spying on South Korea, South Korea spying on North Korea. So the NSA is actually spying on South Korea, spying on North Korea. That's sort of neat. The second is in the summer of 2014, actually in June, and this wasn't talked about a lot when the press was writing about the attack. There were explicit threats by the North Korean government to Sony about showing the movie. And the North Korean government made these threats. Sony was worried. They consulted the U.S. State Department. They consulted some consultants. What should we do? They were told largely that North Korea is full of empty threats. Don't worry about it. They did change the assassination scene, change the visuals to make it a little less dramatic. And they... hang on. That's right. They also pulled... There was talk about whether they should or shouldn't release the movie, actually, in June. What they decided was to release the movie, but take their name off the credits, on the thought that that would fool somebody. So the attack started in September of 2014, and this is when the attackers first penetrated the Sony networks. We know some details about this. A lot of it is still confidential. After the attack, Sony hired a Mandiant to come in and do a forensic analysis, and a lot of that data has not been public. There are a bunch of lawsuits going on, and my guess is more of it will become public in the next year or so. But we believe there was a spear phishing attack that initially got the attackers in, that there was some zero-day exploit involved in escalating privilege, but the attackers very quickly got into the company, got into the entire company, and spent the next 2 months mapping the network, planning their attack, stealing all the data. And it's worth wondering why Sony didn't notice it within these 2 months. I mean, there's a lot of data exfiltrated, and different people who've looked at this really wonder about Sony's bad security, that they A, missed it, and B, it was so easy. And right after the attack, Sony made a lot of statements about how it was a very sophisticated attack. It seems like it wasn't. It was sort of a regular sophisticated attack. So that was the 2 months. The public part of the attack began on November 24th, and that was with the deletion of the hard drives. And in the morning, people came into work and found their hard drives either in the process of being deleted or deleted. This is where the attackers, I think, made their one mistake. Little tip, if you are going to erase someone's hard drive, put the scary picture of the skull and crossbones up after you're done. I mean, there were people within the company who, when they saw the screen and knew something was happening, pulled the plug, killing the computer, saving the data. There are also some people who were not at work that day, some computers off. The totals are that about 3,200 of the company's 6,800 computers were erased, and about 800 of their 1,500 servers. The data completely deleted. I mean, I've seen articles talk about the 7 overwrites, and I think that's the DoD standard the attackers used to erase the data. There was a post to Reddit. The group that took credit for this attack were known as the Guardians of Peace, calling themselves the GOP. This is also the initials of a prominent American political party. No relation, but that was confusing in the first day. And within the United States government, work on attribution began immediately. It was recognized as a serious attack, and inside the NSA, inside the FBI, work began immediately to figure out who did this. On November 26th, that's 2 days later, 4 unreleased movies appeared on BitTorrent. And this is the first example of the attackers releasing the data. So 4 movies appeared, and no word from the attackers. December 1st was the first linking of the attack with the movie The Interview. And I don't know if you remember the first week, there was a lot of speculation on who did it. The press was interested. This was the story, and who did it was the question. And everyone was speculating. The first speculation that it might be North Korea happened on December 1st, and it was NBC News. It's a U.S. news organization. So it was not the attackers, it was not Sony, it was simply a speculation on the news. December 3rd was the second major leak. This is the first leakage of company data. And this included employee data, executive salaries. The attackers seem to curate the data. There will be a number of releases, and they seem to be designed for maximal press attention. The executive salaries are something very interesting. The press will write about it, especially if you pay your female executives much less than your male executives. So that was the news story. December 3rd, another leak. Password, security certs, accounting information. A little security tip, do not put your passwords in a clear text file marked passwords. It just looks dumb.
December 7th, the third major leak, budgets, financial reports, banking statements, license agreements, employee contract. December 8th, lots more emails. Also on December 8th, this is a full week after that NBC speculation, the Guardians of Peace released a message linking the attack to the movie The Interview. I read a quote from it. "Stop immediately showing the movie of terrorism which can break the regional peace and cause the war." All right, so not native English speakers we're learning here. So speculation is really running rampant on who did this. And I think this is interesting. Right? If you are an IT person in Sony, you are trying to recover your network, recover data, bring things back online. The thing you don't care about is who did it. If you are anybody else in the world, the only thing you care about is who did it. Right? You had this really interesting difference. But in the press, who did it was the story. This North Korea thing got a lot of traction, and the FBI, who's doing the investigation, actually went out in public and said that, we don't know. This is FBI Director, Cyber Division. There is no attribution to North Korea at this point. Right? Stop speculating. We're doing our job. December 10th, 5th and 6th major leak. Entertainment deals in the works. Lots of information about the anti-piracy efforts. If you remember, there was that story of the movie companies ganging up on Google. This is where it came from. December 13th, another major leak. Lots of more internal corporate documents. This stuff's all online, all searchable if you want to look for stuff. And it's pretty much been mined for interesting things, but I'm sure there's a lot more there. Another leak on December 14th, December 16th. And there was another, this is where we had an explicit threat from the Guardians of Peace. Because now the company's leery about the movie, and in the United States, movie theaters are now worried about the movie. And the message was, remember the 11th of September 2001. And this was taken as an explicit threat of actual real-world terrorism, right, blowing it up, against movie theaters that show the movie. And this scared movie theaters. I mean, the reason there wasn't a theatrical release of this movie is this. So on December 19th, this is 3 weeks after the attack, the FBI announces the results of their investigation. I'm going to read the quote because the quote's interesting. As a result of our investigation, and in close collaboration with other U.S. departments and agencies, the FBI now has enough information to conclude that the North Korean government is responsible for these actions. All right. The U.S. publicly blames North Korea. President Obama says something, same day. We cannot have a society in which some dictator someplace can start imposing censorship here in the United States. The U.S. blames North Korea, and nobody believes them. Right, now, there's some evidence in this FBI statement. There was malware similarities between this attack and something called Dark Soul, which is an attack from 2013, I think, against South Korea, attributed to North Korea. There's some information about the similarities of networks used in both attacks. But there's really very little evidence, and there was a lot of mistrust in the academic community. Right? If you remember that statement, it alluded to secret evidence. What was it? In close collaboration with other U.S. government departments and agencies. I mean, who's that? That's the NSA, right? But it's not actually said, and we don't know what this evidence is. I mean, the NSA might have recorded phone calls discussing the attack. Right? In my fantasies, they have the document with Kim Jong-un's signature on the bottom saying, let's do this. Right? You know, we don't know. We didn't know then, but we know now from a New York Times article in January that there was a human operative involved, that there was some intelligence source inside the North Korean government that we had information from. But there were a lot of skeptics here. I mean, a lot of them. I think the most articulate one was Mark Rogers from Cloudflare, who wrote a really good blog post of basically, don't be ridiculous, it can't be North Korea. I mean, I wrote something. You know, there's a lot of reasons why it makes no sense. But if you think about it, Sony had a vested interest in it being a government. Right? They have a lot of contracts, there's a lot of lawsuits. If they can invoke a force majeure clause, if it was an act of war, I mean, they lose a lot of liability. Right? So a lot of reasons why Sony would want this. But, you know, it doesn't make sense to me. And it didn't make sense to anybody. There were some alternate theories. Right? The most obvious one is hackers. Right? The attack that this was most similar to at the time is the attack against H.B. Gary. I mean, LulzSec breaking into H.B. Gary Federal, stealing all their data, releasing it to the public. Right? That's what it looked most like. And Sony's been a company that hackers have loved to hate since like 2005. Right? They've been the subject of many hacker attacks over the years. But in 2005, it was because they installed a rootkit on their CDs, which infected computers. But they've made some dumb mistakes in security. So hackers made a lot of sense. Disgruntled employees. A company called Norse Security had that as a theory. They even thought they knew who it was. They briefed the FBI, then sort of disappeared, so that probably wasn't it. Some kind of kids playing politics. I mean, we see this a lot, where there are international tensions and basically kids get involved. I mean, Russia against Estonia was like that. U.S. versus China, India versus Pakistan. And lots of examples, Israel versus Syria, of unaffiliated national individuals doing things. You know, there was some thought of a hybrid attack, that hackers did it and North Korea kind of co-opted it. You know, in that FBI statement, and the FBI's been very clear afterwards, they're not saying that North Korean nationals pushed the buttons. North Korea could have hired hackers. I mean, that was never made clear. So that was an alternate speculation. December 22nd, 23rd, North Korea was the victim of a DDoS attack. The country basically went offline for a day. It was thought this might be retaliation by the U.S. The U.S. denied it. On the one hand, it might be. On the other hand, you know, North Korea has pretty tenuous internet connections. So they go down somewhat regularly, so it could be coincidence. On January 2nd, the U.S. imposed sanctions on North Korea in retaliation. We actually did something in retaliation. We basically didn't do very much. This was for show. North Korea is already the most heavily sanctioned country on the planet. There's like not much left to do to them. But we found a few things and did them. January 7th, so New Year, FBI Director James Comey is in New York. He's speaking at Fordham University. And he's again talking about this because it's hard to imagine that nobody's believing him. And he gives more evidence. He says that the North Koreans got sloppy, that they did work to mask their IP address when they would go in and attack or go in and do their work, but occasionally they messed up. Right? Occasionally they revealed their real IP address. Again, skeptics were unconvinced. There's another Mark Rogers blog post also worth reading on how this evidence isn't any good either. I was still skeptical. For me, I wasn't convinced until January 19th. And January 19th, there's a New York Times article by David Sanger. It's worth reading, and I recommend looking it up, where he talks about not the attack, but what went on in the administration in the weeks after the attack, with enough evidence that led me to believe that, yes, as amazing as it seems, North Korea did attack Sony. And the FBI was correct. There are still skeptics. There are still people who don't believe, probably in this audience, who don't believe that North Korea did it. I am convinced at this point. All right, so why is this interesting? I think it encapsulates quite a lot of what goes on in cyber war and cyber conflict. And I'll go through the points. The first is that the cyber war rhetoric is real and it's scary. That all of this war talk affects policy. Right? We had U.S. politicians, former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich calls this pure cyber warfare. Senator John McCain, a manifestation of a new form of warfare. This hyperbole obscures debate. Nomenclature is important, and we don't have good nomenclature. We don't have good words to describe these kinds of attacks. And cyber warfare, calling it war, I think is very scary and very dangerous. But we don't have a better word, so we're using it. And I think we need to think about better ways of describing things and better ways of describing retaliations and policies and things around them, because the language is going to bite us. The second is that the target is really interesting here. I mean, who would have believed that the first major attack by a foreign government against the United States in cyberspace would be against a movie company? Right? It wasn't even on our top 20 list. But here it was. And there was talk in the United States about having this be critical infrastructure, which makes no sense. Right? How it being attacking free speech, free expression, which almost makes no sense. Right? But here it was. The objective, right, wasn't theft. It wasn't really coercion. Right? It wasn't really embarrassment, but it was kind of all of those things. Right? The motive wasn't a normal motive that we're used to dealing with. Right? Not your standard criminal attack, not your standard IP theft, not your standard DDoS attack. It was this weird hybrid of motive. Because you kind of got a weird hybrid of world leader over there, so it kind of makes sense. But it was weird when it happened, and confusing when it happened. Right? We're all vulnerable to this sort of thing, and I think this is important. I mean, I always think of attackers along two axes, skill and focus. Right? And your low-skill, low-focus attacker, those are your script kiddies. Those are the things that happen all the time. Right? Your high-skill, low-focus, those are your zero-day exploits. I mean, the people who invent new attacks, who write attack tools. Low-skill, high-focus, your basic targeted attack. High-skill, high-focus, APT. Right? This is advanced persistent threat. And we know, as people in the industry, against a sufficiently skilled, motivated, funded attacker, the defenders lose. The attackers get in. Right? That's what this is. You know, and this is the same thing that happened to Hacking Team later this year, happened to Ashley Madison. Right? A sufficiently skilled, motivated, funded attacker will get in. The difference is absolute versus relative security. Against a criminal attack who just wants a big block of credit card numbers, what matters is, are you more secure than the other guy? Right? If you are, the attacker goes there. Against a targeted attack, is it, are you more secure than the attacker is skilled? And in a lot of cases, we are not. And against a nation state, we are not. So the vulnerability is high, and it's not going away. And so how do we deal with it? On the other hand, Sony had some really bad security. We saw that in the documents, a little safety tip. Do not put your passwords in a clear text file marked passwords. It just looks embarrassing. But that was one of the documents that was published. I have a great quote from the Sony Executive Director of Information Security. This is in 2005. This is after an attack of that year. And this is what he's saying. He's saying, look, we're trying to remain profitable for our shareholders, and we literally could go broke trying to cover everything. So you make risk-based decisions. What are the most important things that are absolutely required by law? It sounds like your boss, doesn't it? You got to do better than this. You can't do the minimum required by law. You've got to do enough to make yourself reasonably secure. And Sony didn't. There's also a democratization of tactics I think is really important. Right? We're not fighting a cyber war, but we are increasingly seeing warlike tactics used in broader cyber conflicts. And that's what's interesting. Right? Technology spreads capability. In the real world, you can tell the attacker by the weaponry. If we walked outside in the park, I guess it's over there, and we saw a tank, we would know the government was involved because only governments can afford tanks. Right? That shorthand doesn't work on the internet. Everyone uses the same tools, the same tactics, the same techniques. I mean, it's amazing that we were having a legitimate debate about whether a cyber attack was the result of a country with a $20 billion military budget or a couple of guys in a basement somewhere. I mean, that is extraordinary. And the fact that we can't tell the difference is huge. From a policy perspective, from a geopolitical perspective, in every way, this scares people, and it should. Right? There should be a difference between governments and people. But in cyberspace, there's not. I mean, recently, I think last year, the hacker group Anonymous said they were going to take out ISIS for us. Now, good for them, but what? Or in 2010, another arm of Anonymous threatened NATO. Right? It's not supposed to be that a couple of guys can threaten a military alliance with nuclear weapons. Right? That's not supposed to happen. But in cyberspace, this kind of thing happens. Politics, the politically motivated attacking is now increasingly a thing. And think of politics very broadly here. Right? Nationalistic, ethical, religious. We see it against governments, against corporations, institutions, individuals. There's a lot more of this non-financial attacking, non-financial hacking. It's real, and it's affecting politics. And it's something I don't think we're really equipped to deal with yet. And attack attribution is hard. I think one of the important lessons of this whole Sony incident is how hard attribution is. I'll compare two examples. In 2006, Israel attacked a Syrian nuclear power plant. They did it with planes and bombs. Now, we could argue about whether they should or they shouldn't, but if you were Syria, you were able to look up in the sky, see the planes, see the flag painted on their tails, and they know who did it. In 2010, the US and Israel attacked Iran, attacked an Iranian nuclear power plant. But we did it with a cyber weapon. The difference is that Iran had no idea who attacked them. They actually had no idea they were attacked in the beginning. Now, it's possible the U.S. told Iran through a diplomatic channel, but they didn't have to. And on the internet, it's very hard, sometimes impossible, to attribute an attack. And remember the number of people who didn't know if they were attacked or not? Right? It's even worse. You didn't even know if you're the victim of an attack. The Stuxnet, the attack against Iran, was made to look like a failure in centrifuge equipment. You're an Iranian nuclear research scientist, and your first thought is, we misprogrammed it. We did it wrong. Not that, Israel attacked me. Although probably now you'll think that first, but back then you didn't. And this attribution is very difficult. Right? I mean, it's difficult politically because our policy relies on the fact that we know who attacked us. And it's difficult technically because technically we can't know who attacked us. Right? Packets don't come with return addresses. Right? It's really easy for an attacker to pretend to come from somewhere else. And if I was the NSA, I would launch a lot of my attacks through China because everyone knows attacks come through China. And it's probably true that a lot of the world's cyber attacks get laundered through China. Right? False flagging is easy, and it happens all the time. And when we can attribute attacks, the process can take weeks. It took 3 weeks for the United States to go public with the fact that North Korea did it. Now, to be fair, we don't know how much of that 3 weeks was figure it out and how much of it was figure out what to do about it. But some of that, and we believe the majority of that time, was who did it, figure out who did it. And there are huge problems with potential misattributions. Getting this wrong is bad. And there are some examples where we believe we got attribution wrong, and lots of examples where we don't attribute at all. So you've got this really attribution, deception, arms race going on. Right? The attacker's trying to hide who they are, and the defender's trying to figure out who the attackers are. And the U.S. is in an interestingly powerful position here, kind of, I think, unique in the world. Basically because the NSA surveils most of the internet, so we can see a lot of what's going on. Right? The NSA has a bigger budget than everyone else in the world combined. And also because of the way the internet is built, quite a lot of the international data streams flow through the United States. Now, you email Japan, it likely goes through the U.S. Just because that's the way the cables are run, that's the way the data flows. So there's a lot more the U.S. can pick up. This is really irritating Brazil right now. Right, you mean if I email Europe, the U.S. gets a copy? Yeah, kind of. Right, because it goes through Florida. And there's talk about setting up a direct Europe-South America cable to bypass that, which the U.S. will tap, so don't even bother. So in 2012, the U.S. Secretary of Defense is talking about attribution on the internet. And he says publicly, I think this is interesting, and it's a quote, that the U.S. has made significant advances in identifying the origins of cyber attacks. We've heard similar comments from other U.S. officials and ex-officials, that the attribution problem really isn't a problem anymore. And we don't know what this means. We don't know if the U.S. has made some fundamental technological advance in packet identification. I kind of think not, but maybe. Or just that we're so good at espionage that we are involved in the planning process. Right? We watch you do it. There's an interesting deterrence effect here. If you've noticed, in the past couple of years, the United States has been much more likely to publicly blame another country for an attack. We've indicted Chinese military officials for attacks against U.S. corporations. We've blamed Russia for attacks. We were very careful in the OMB attack not to name anybody. Someone named China early on and then quickly backtracked, and there's been no public attribution. But by and large, we are more likely to attribute attacks. And I think there's a deterrence effect here. I think the game theory is that we want to signal to the world that if you try something, we will know it's you. that you will not be able to hide your origins, that we will figure it out and we will be able to know that you attacked us. But even if we do know, providing evidence can be tricky. And this is a real lesson from Sony. Right? The U.S. says North Korea attacked us, and nobody believes them. Right? And a bunch of reasons, right? Broad distrust of the intelligence community. If you remember the whole weapons of mass destruction debacle, right? FBI providing very scant evidence. Right? And there's just not a lot of trust here. And there are several types of attribution, and this is worth thinking about. I'll give you 3 levels. There's the bottom, right? I know you did it. There's the middle, I know, prove to you, I know you did it. And there's the top, the hardest. I know you did it and can prove to the world, I know you did it. Right? The U.S. did 1. We might have done 2. We failed miserably at 3. And 3 is important. Right? You know, in a world where we're going to expect that the public believes us and goes along with our retaliatory actions, we're going to have to convince the public that we're right. And if attribution is based on secret evidence, we won't be able to do that. Right? Secret evidence works great here. It might work here, but it doesn't work here. Right? And the NSA was unwilling to say, you know, we got this because we have implants all through North Korea, you know, and we're just watching them do stuff. Or, as we know now, we have secretly and illegally basically built an IDS around the United States, and we're watching the packets come in, and we had the data, and we just looked at it. Right? They're unwilling to say any of that, and people just aren't going to believe them. And I think more and more of our attribution will come from secret evidence, regardless of the country. And that'll mean more and more of, please trust us, and I think more and more of schism in the face of that. And what this means is that it's hard to figure out who's in charge of a defense. So Scott Charney of Microsoft made this point. He's the first one I ever heard to make this point. I think it's really worth thinking about. When you're attacked in cyberspace, there are a variety of institutions you can call on for your defense. You can call on the police. You can call on the military. You can call on whoever does counterterrorism in your country. You can call on a bunch of commercial products and services. You can call on your corporate lawyers. But the legal regime in which your defense operates depends on 2 things. Depends on who's attacking you and why. And in cyberspace, when you're attacked, the precise 2 things you don't know are who's attacking you and why. Oh, and you've got 2 milliseconds to figure it out. Remember, it took the FBI 3 weeks to figure out that North Korea attacked Sony. So it's an interesting question to ask. Whose job is it to defend Sony? If they're attacked by, the hacker group Anonymous, you could argue it's the police matter. If they're attacked by North Korea, it's much more a military matter. But whose job is it to defend Sony when we figure, in the time it takes to figure out whose job is to defend Sony? Well, the only reasonable answer here is it's Sony's. We're kind of all stuck doing this ourselves while the wheels of attribution turn. But adequate defense can't wait. Right? Sony can't say, okay, I'll wait 3 weeks. You guys figure it out, then let me know. Right? That doesn't work. It's not going to work in any business. Real defense, IT on the ground, incident response, recovery, mitigation, all of that has to happen immediately. It cannot wait for us to figure out who the attacker is and who's the government defender. What are the legal rules here? The legal rules are going to be different if it's a person or a country. if it's crime or terrorism, if it's an act of war or not. Right? The rules are going to be different. And all of our policy is designed around those different sets of rules. And that just falls completely apart in cyberspace because you're just not going to know. And when you see a lot of the debates that are going on in various countries about which government institution is in charge of defense and in charge of retaliation, all those things, what they're debating is, what they're arguing over and fighting over is who's in charge in the meantime. Right? Who's the default organization who's in charge? Do we assume it's an act of war? Do we assume it's an act of crime? Do we assume it's an internal corporate matter? What do we assume before we know? And I think it's going to be extremely difficult policy because we're just not set up to figuring that out in milliseconds. And there's no way to figure it out in milliseconds. Right? So what we need is good defense without attribution. Remember what I was saying, inside Sony's IT department, the one thing they didn't care about is who did it. Outside, it's the only thing anybody cares about. I mean, the more we can have fast, flexible, effective incident response without the need for attribution, the better off we're going to be. Attribution is going to have to come later. All right, incident response, both technical and non-technical. Sort of interesting to watch that inside Sony. The response went within a couple of days from, we are Sony responding as a company to this crisis, to we are individuals concerned with our careers responding to this crisis. The corporate cohesion broke very quickly, and people were acting individually. I think it was interesting to watch. I think it's because they didn't have a good incident response program in place to understand what to do. And the fact that the comm system went out. Right? When they lost email and phone, it's only people who have each other's cell phone numbers who can talk. And everyone else just can't. I think that made a big difference. So attribution becomes a forensics problem. Now, I think there are going to be issues here, too. I mean, you know that, I think, was it next week, United States and China are having this big cyber summit. And this talk about a treaty, the first ever treaty in cyberspace about cyber warfare. And it might actually happen. I think it'll be something minor. I mean, these things always start small. And it'll be something like, no first strike, no cyber attacks against hospitals or schools. I mean, you can imagine some of the things you can get both the United States and China to agree to. But the problem, and the problem is going to be that you can't tell an attack until after it's over. So the two terms that are used inside the NSA, I think they're worth adopting, are CNE and CNA. CNE is computer network exfiltration. That means stealing stuff. And CNA is computer network attack. That means destroying stuff. They are very different politically, militarily, socially, ethically, legally. In the United States, CNE is the NSA. CNA is the U.S. Cyber Command. They are separate organizations, separate chains of command, separate missions. But technically, they're the same thing. If you think about attack, the difference between CNA and CNE, I mean, every step is exactly the same until the very last, which is either copy *** or delete ***. Right? That's the only difference. Which is why in the United States, the NSA and U.S. Cyber Command are both located at Fort Meade, Maryland, and they are both run by the same officer, right, Admiral Rogers right now, because while they are politically separate, they are technically identical. Right? So how do you enforce a treaty when every action except actually pulling the trigger, you can say, well, that's not attack, that's espionage, and espionage is okay, we all know that. I think that's going to be really difficult. And what's allowed and what's not allowed is very blurry. I mean, and we have this problem. The United States really didn't like the OPM attack. And the OPM attack, I think, was a sea change in U.S. policy because it affected every government employee. If you don't know this attack, this was an attack against the Office of Personnel Management, which had the personnel files of every government employee, including their clearance documents, which is a very intimate multi-page document you fill out with all the embarrassing things you've done, which are now in the hands of somebody, we believe, China. It's very hard for us to criticize China for doing this when basically, U.S. does it as well. You had General Hayden, former director of the NSA, say on camera, "Well, that was a great idea. We would have done that if we could have in a second." You sure kidding? Right? So we're both doing it, which is going to make it hard to limit it being done. And the fact that it's so similar to attack is going to make it hard to have any kind of treaties. All right, so there are three kinds of attacker here that we need to think about. First one is APT, Advanced Persistent Threat. Countries that are big enough and powerful enough to write their own attack tools. China, Russia, US, UK, Israel, a bunch of the NATO countries. Below that are the countries that buy from cyber weapons arms manufacturers like Hacking Team. Syria is there, Sudan is there, Kazakhstan. And below that, you have cyber militias. These are countries that just basically use criminal hacking tools. Syria did that. Actually, China does that as well. So you have a blurring. There's those three different types of nation states. My worry is that we're in the early years of a cyber war arms race. And I think this is why the treaty is so important, and at least the negotiations are important. We are now in the early years of countries building up their cyber weapons capabilities. Right? Stockpiling 0 days, stockpiling weapons. Right? The Presidential Decision Directive number 20, United States document, worth reading, a very strategic cyber war document about how we are drawing up target lists and building weapons, very much like a nuclear stockpile. In the way it looks. And my fear is that we're all going to be in the blast radius here. And lots of examples of companies being the victims of nation-state attacks. Right? North Korea attacks Sony. China attacks GitHub. United States attacks the Brazilian oil company. Iran attacks the Saudi oil company. Again and again, countries are attacking companies because they are more vulnerable than the target country's infrastructure. And I think this is going to become increasingly a problem, something we have to deal with. So thank you.